Hey guys, we are going to do our Southern Empires, Asia and Africa. This will be a big help for you as you go through this week. This will be kind of the rundown on the key concepts here. I'll get into a couple things that are a little bit more in depth, but by doing this, this will be another participation thing. And we'll kind of take the place of our lesson. We're kind of combining here 1.3 and 1.5. We're also really, in actuality, getting into Unit 2 a bit with the Indian Ocean Exchange, but that's great. We're going to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and then we'll kind of recap it when we get into Unit 2, probably in 2 weeks. So, again, we're just going to keep kind of moving forward and getting the basic concepts of Unit 1 and then Unit 2 because they are the least tested on your AP exam. But again, we want to get a feel of everything here. So please, as you are watching this, feel free to pause it, write down some of these key concepts, keep those notes in your Unit 1 outline, and then reference them when you're asking me questions in class if something doesn't make sense, okay? So the first aspect, again, when we talk about South Asia, we're talking about really India and then Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, this area, and then maybe even into current day Indonesia. Okay. When we get into Africa, we're going to talk about the Sahara Desert and Trans-Saharan across this range because if you look at a map, this is all pretty much desert in here. And then we talk about sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about West Africa over here with the Kingdom of Mali, which is a big one, and Ghana. We also talk about sub-Saharan Africa. When we get down here, this area is called the Swahili Coast, and we'll get to that. But most of the big areas for Africa in this time period are both over here, where there is a lot of gold and a lot of another resource that you probably wouldn't think is insanely helpful and valuable at the time, but it is. And then down here in the Swahili Coast, because it gives you access to the Indian Ocean trade. Okay. The first thing that was needed in order to make this area viable, and one of the reasons why it wasn't viable until the 1300s in this way, was due to the understanding of the weather patterns and the climate patterns here. Weather changes, climate does not. But these are fairly consistent. Again, the extent of which it happens, it could be way worse or a little bit milder, but it's pretty much always going to happen around the same time, and that is the monsoon. If you click this video, and the expectation is that you go through these slides on your own as well and reference them, they are in the daily agenda. If you click this video, it will show you what the monsoon season looks like in India. This takes place right here on the map, so you can kind of get yourself an understanding there. But it's essential to farming, okay? Sometimes the urban areas, though, in India are not able to handle this amount of rainfall. And one of the reasons why currently India cannot handle this is that all of these infrastructural systems were set up by the British over the course of 300 years, essentially, from the 1600s to 1947, when India finally became independent of British rule. And since then, India is a very, very corrupt place in terms of their government, not the people, the government. And there's a lot of back and forth and government siphoning funds like there is in every country, but it's most seen in India because they need this. These infrastructural systems that were put in place as recent as 1947 are obviously crumbling, and the government isn't doing terribly much to try to push the nation forward and figure that out. So when you look at urban areas, the monsoon is devastating. But India also would not be able to survive without it because this area can get very hot, it can get very dry, and that rainy season is needed to fully kind of water irrigate all of the crops that are needed to sustain the nation. The resource that I mentioned before was salt. And all through this region, particularly even up into southern and eastern Europe, like I showed you this picture before, this is Poland. Salt was the biggest trade commodity in this time period, not gold, it was salt, because salt was actually usable. I can't eat gold. They attract animals, which gives you livestock and again meats or milk or eggs. You have furs, you have wool, things like that you can get with the animals there. It also helps to kill bacteria. They used it on battlefields into wounds. Provides electrolytes to help people maintain energy throughout difficult situations. So the finding of salt and the trading of salt was one of the things that kept this region alive and really, really motivated the trade early on. It gave rise to, really, if you see how these are linked, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which is a key concept and a full unit in and of itself in Unit 2. But really, the key concepts here are that it was not politically regulated and that it was self-governing. The mariners and the merchants and the trade experts were the ones that kind of controlled it. And then the government started to embrace that because it made them money. The reason why this was allowed to happen was because of the monsoon. Boats would get places and be stranded for long periods of time. But when you had the Indian dhow, which had the curved sails that could go either way, or the Chinese yunk that could take large quantities of people and goods from place to place, it became much more viable than the Silk Road, because you can put more on a boat than you can on a camel's back or being pulled by beasts of burden throughout the desert and mountainous regions. You can just kind of straight shot when you are on the water, as long as you know which way the wind is blowing and you have a tool that was created by the Chinese and then passed on throughout the Middle East and in India, which I hope you would get, is the compass. African trade, again, we're talking about trans-Saharan, which is kind of over the desert, linking some of these empires and some of these major cities. And then you're talking about sub-Saharan here, along this, what we call the Swahili coast. We've got places like Zanzibar, Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe, and places like Ethiopia as well. And they were highly influenced by the Muslim traders. Even in those early years, in the 1st century, 2nd century after the Prophet Muhammad, these Muslim merchants from the Arabian Peninsula started taking caravans throughout Africa, and that created serious cultural diffusion because the locals in Africa were so isolated from each other that there wasn't a lot of communication, and the Muslim merchants were living in a way that just made sense. They were rational thinkers, they were educated, they were devoted, they had rituals that made them seem special. And again, I'll use the word sophisticated. And when you see that kind of thing, they were organized, they were disciplined. And some of these African tribes were like, wow, that looks special. They seem to have it figured out. They have this peace of mind. I kind of want to be a part of that. And that was one of the reasons, not by force and not by military, that when you look at North Africa and West Africa starting to take on Islam very quickly, it was because they liked that idea of having some sort of structure and organization. As the Swahili coast started to grow, and we will probably do our exercise. Hopefully we can do it remotely. It was kind of fun last year in terms of trading and seeing what people would do. And Islam grows. That's where the term Swahili comes from. Their main things to trade were gold, timber, and then ivory. Obviously, ivory comes from elephants. But those raw resources would then get shipped up to India and to China and turned into finished products that could be then resold or re-exported or traded for a lot of money. Please read these links, the background on the Bantu peoples or the summary of the Swahili coast. It's very, very, very important that you have a little bit of background on Bantu migrations and what the Swahili coast was and why it was linked. Here's a video of Bantu. If you look at the bottom of this slide, I kind of put a little bit of a synopsis there, but Bantu, as it spread from West Africa down into the sub-Saharan region and then really started to take off down here on that Swahili coast, it blended with Arabic. And out of a Bantu base and then an Arabic kind of influence there, we see we see Swahili come to be the number one really African language throughout the region. In all honesty, it's kind of like English. English, if you didn't know, it is a Germanic language. When you see some of the German words that we use every day, like just for example, water is Wasser, and father is Vater or Mutter. Those words are very, very close to English from German. But then our big influences come from Greek and Latin as well. So we have this kind of a mixture of base languages for English to come about. So it's kind of like Swahili, I would say, as well. The biggest and greatest sub-Saharan empire in this time period was called the Great Zimbabwe. And it was located kind of off the Swahili coast, but really it took all of the materials here that would start coming in through these Bantu migrations. And the reason that these Bantu migrations were happening was they had a larger population, which came from more crops that could be sustained that you'll see in that video. And one of the reasons they got crops was the Bantu were the first kind of organized iron workers or metal workers in this region, and they made these just simple tools that made harvesting and planting crops so much easier. There's very, very little evidence that Great Zimbabwe was even there. There are minor examples of it, but because of the forest getting depleted and the overgrazing from the cows, this place went belly up later on in the time period, and then was finally kind of wiped out by the Portuguese when they started to sail. But that's another region. One of the bigger centers in the Arab world was actually in Aden in Yemen. And again, you can see the location puts it here perfect to get resources down from Egypt and the Mediterranean. It also has a stop from the Swahili coast and then gives you a straight shot over here to that west coast of India, which can then be connected to East Asia. So this is a really, really big trading port. And if you want to see the kind of trouble that Yemen is facing, this article really provides some great insight into why Yemen is going through such a hard time right now with civil war and outside influence impacting that, as well as drought, famine, infighting, things like that. It's just an absolute mess in Yemen. It's very confusing to understand, who the good guy is in that situation, because really when civil war happens, there are no winners, there are just losers. The Gujarat in India was one of the first areas that started to focus in on specializing in finished products. They were absolutely the world leader in finished products. Again, you take your beads and your stones and you have them individually in chunks, and they don't look like this. Again, look up on your own what a diamond looks like, what a raw diamond looks like. It's just an ugly rock. I mean, to me, if you put a $100 million diamond that was raw in front of me, I would have no idea what it is. It would just look like an ugly rock to me. But once that is polished down and you have these skilled crafts workers take those beads and make them into bracelets or make them into luxury items, they then their value then increases 10 times. And the thing to understand is that when I think Americans think of India and Americans think of China, we think of cheap labor and we think of raw materials. That wasn't always the case. This was a situation where they did everything in their country. They took the raw materials that were being imported from other places or the raw materials from their own countries and made them into finished products. Whereas now we kind of think of Europe and the United States or Japan doing those things. That wasn't the case in those days. Europe wasn't doing stuff like this. They didn't have the craftsmen. These beads alone would have sold for so much money in Europe if someone had the riches to get them. And a lot of the kings and queens, as travel started, they sent emissaries to India and to China to learn this way of craftsmanship and fine work, and then brought that back to Europe. But in this time period, it wasn't Europe that was the leader. Europe was absolutely not even in the picture for finished products. Really, the blending of cultures is an important concept in this, and no area was more important than the Strait of Malacca, because instead of going from the Indian coast all the way around, again, they found this strait, and it brought them in contact with Malaysia and current-day Singapore, which is really one of the most diverse places, if not the most diverse place in the entire world. Singapore has 80 some languages spoken even today. The key figure in this region during the time period, we've referenced him. We're not going to get really into him yet until we start to talk about the Ming, but his name was Zheng He. And by clicking on this, you can kind of see what Zheng He's role was, how he went about it, how he established contact with both the east and west coasts of India and even the west coast of Africa, which is unheard of. When you're talking the early 1300s, you've got this guy going from all the way in the Chinese capital of current-day Beijing and going all the way around the Chinese mainland and then through the Indonesian and Malaysian islands, all the way to touch land in India, to make contact there, to trade there, to bring things back. The side story, in his first trip to India, he brought back a giraffe. And this is how animals started to go to different areas, because giraffes, no Chinese person had ever seen one. So when he brought that back, he became untouchable. He became like this like, you are this figure that I need to trust from the emperor, because they thought that the giraffe was the unicorn. And here's this guy that went somewhere else and found this unicorn, and he brought it back. And now, hey, you need more money to go find more unicorns or more stuff or more, this, that, and the other thing, go do it. Like, here you go. So he kind of had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted in terms of travel. Highly important here, to click on this, you see the spread of Islam through the Arab world and into Africa. Really, one of the key concepts here was the building, and this was a term used from the Prophet Muhammad, the Ummah, or the community, and creating this close-knit Muslim community where anyone who is a Muslim around the world is part of that same type of I guess, moral code, or united by their faith in Allah, as well as understanding that Muhammad was his prophet. Ibn Battuta shows the spread through the area, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and as far as Persia. So he's a guy that you can see even in getting all the way to China. Eventually, he's a guy that saw the world and saw how much the religion was spreading. This is a quick video that will kind of show you the key concepts there of Ibn Battuta. Africa, throughout the north and west, the trans-Saharan region, that's where you see really the extent of Islam big time. The Songhai and Mali empires were wealthier beyond belief, and by having that wealth, the influence of Islam really helped them to stabilize their society, to expand, to unite. And their key guy in that is a guy named Mansa Musa. Okay, he took a Hajj and built this capital of Timbuktu as like the famous world center. I mean, Timbuktu was considered to be one of the absolute glorious cities in all of the world during the time period because it was a cultural center. It had economic power. It could determine what went down. And then I ask a question here. What was the major economic result of his Hajj? Rather than having you look that up, I'll just kind of tell you. Mansa Musa was worth an estimated, by today's standards, like $300 billion. So he is considered to be the richest person in world history, financially and in terms of gold. He went on this Hajj, and one of the principles of Islam is charity. So on his way, he was throwing out handfuls and fistfuls and bags fulls of gold. And in doing so, he thinks he's doing right by the people and giving them something. But what it did was it just absolutely destroyed the economy of Cairo for 2 generations, really. We're talking about a 40-year recession and depression in a place like Cairo because of Mansa Musa going through there. He gave out so much gold that it devalued gold. So now all of a sudden, if I had 10 gold coins that had X amount of buying power, those 10 gold coins were maybe worth 2. So all of a sudden, I think I have 10, but really my 10 is only worth 2 because he's flooded the market and made it impossible for the government of Cairo to stabilize it. So he thought he was doing good, but there's unintended consequences there. This is just an example of cultural diffusion. Again, that to me looks nothing like a mosque. I think the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul as a mosque, or I think of the mosque in Jerusalem, or a mosque in Saudi Arabia, or the Taj Mahal. Even, like, that's how I picture a mosque. Certainly not like this, but this is how Africans built their structures and their castles or their religious centers, because these were the materials that were available to them. They weren't going to import marble all the way from India just to build a mosque, because that's a waste of money. They were going to use the materials that they had. So again, cultural diffusion in terms of architecture. Last but not least, we're going to talk about India with the Delhi Sultanate. India, as many of you know or should know, is a majority Hindu country. The question that I ask here for you is, why were Muslims so successful in conquering a country that was overwhelmingly Hindu? And if you take a second to think about it and use what you might or might not know about India today, it actually becomes pretty simple. How does this 10% minority conquer 90%? Simple. Fragmentation. When you say Hindu, it's not like saying Christianity or Islam or Judaism, which, again, Christianity has various different sects. You have Catholicism, you have Protestantism, and in Protestantism you have Mormon and Methodist and Lutheran and Episcopalian and Presbyterian and Anglican, Calvinist. You have all these different sects, but they're kind of similar. You can go from neighborhood to neighborhood, and the practice of Hinduism is vastly different, but they're both Hindu, and they don't have really a different way to say it, as well as north to south is very, very different. And even today, northern Indians and southern Indians don't necessarily respect each other, and some of those rivalries aren't as friendly as you'd think. Just like in Italy today, the north in Italy, if you're from Milan or Genoa or Venice or Florence, you look at Naples or Sicily like, ugh, like peasants. Ugh. I took German classes with a woman from Hamburg, and Hamburg is a city right on the North Sea in the north of Germany. And she said, "Oh, you've been to Germany?" And we said, "Yeah, yeah. We went to Munich and all through Bavaria." She was, "Ugh, Bavaria, bunch of hicks, hillbillies." And I was like, "Whoa, okay, yikes." So again, you have that regionalism, and they weren't united and they weren't connected. So in being that fragmented, you had this organized, militaristic, Turkic horse driven dynasty that comes in and basically takes over a land that had a lot of Hindus and became a minority leader. This is a key concept when you talk about cultural interactions, especially in India. And even today, these things are in people's minds. And I have an essay here that I would like you to read, because in some situations people say, the Muslims weren't that bad, and some say, no, they were awful. So the thesis shows kind of both sides there, but there were a lot of forced conversions. Hinduism, depending on who the person is, can be considered polytheistic and can be considered monotheistic. I had a class one day where I said, Hinduism is polytheistic in my first period. It was probably my first year teaching. I said, Hinduism is polytheistic, many gods. Girl in front row said, Mr. Shraver, it is not. It's monotheistic. It is one God that takes many forms. And I went, wow, I didn't know that. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend. She said, no worries. My next period, I said, Hinduism is actually monotheistic. It's one God. It takes many forms. Guy in the front row, no, Mr. Shraver, it's polytheistic. Those are different gods. And I went, wow, my head is spinning. I don't know what to think. So it depends on what type of Hinduism that you practice. But even to an outsider, like if you're a Christian or you're Jewish or you're Muslim and you look at Hinduism, to you, it probably looks polytheistic, even if it is practiced as monotheistic. But it's really no different than Christianity and Catholicism, with the idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit being three separate things, but all part of one God. To me, again, as a rational thinker, the Trinity comes across as polytheistic. I don't know if that's just me, but there was a lot of violence in this consolidation of power. We see that, again, there isn't a lot of consistency with the Delhi Sultanate. You can look again at just the skin tone here. You can tell by looking at, if you thought of in I wouldn't say stereotypical, but if you're going to generalize and say, what does your average Indian person look like, you'd probably think a little darker skin tone. You can see that these sultans from the north were Turkic, so they had a different ethnicity. Again, not only do they have a different religion, but they look different than a majority of the people that they're conquering and ruling over, which really isn't a great thing. But they really wanted to try to limit unrest he conquered them aggressively, but he was also tolerant, which helped the Hindus say, okay, well, I guess this isn't so bad. But when you have his son and then grandsons building mosques in key Hindu areas, focused on only educating Muslims and then taxing the highest caste in Hinduism, you're going to get a lot of backlash. And when you have such a vast subcontinent like India, it's going to be hard to control that when there is unrest. There's a map here. You can see how these areas on the Indian Ocean trade network helped the spread of Islam to even further Southeast Asia as well. And here's the fragmentation of India. But they had two really, really incredible political achievements. Delhi essentially united this region briefly until the Mughals came in, but they united the region under a Muslim leader. And they successfully, by taking over and really shoring up all of these areas in the north, prevented especially this guy, Timur, or Tamerlane, who was one of the most successful Mongol leaders, from taking over the Indian subcontinent. So they blocked Mongol expansion south, and no one had ever really blocked the Mongols before. And they did it by politically uniting that region. And also, they had kind of similar weaponry tactics to the Mongol hordes that were invading. So that's where we'll stop. Remember kind of those key concepts. Go through, look at some of those readings, be familiar with them, and please, please, please ask questions, because I know that I went fast, and normally in a class setting, I would have asked a lot of questions, and you would have responded and asked questions on your own as well. If you have those, send them, post them in the comments on Schoology, so that you can give your classmates chances to answer them too. That's always very, very helpful. See you guys. Good luck on everything. Please let me know if I can do anything to help.